Who should rule? Since ancient times, this question has fueled political thought, leading us today to an almost universal agreement. The people should govern. But what does the people truly mean when Kratos comes to power? Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 05, Episode 06, where we embark on a profound journey through Chapter 6 of Andrew Heywood's political theory. An introduction dissecting the intricate concepts of democracy, representation, and the elusive public interest. So yeah, we're about to take a deep dive into democracy. It's a word you hear everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it often means really different things depending on who you ask. Political campaigns, just chatting with friends, everyone says they're for it. But what is popular rule, actually? How does it work in the real world? And this idea of the public interest, can we even agree on what that means? It's way more complex than it looks. Our mission today is basically to try and untangle some of that for you.
That's a great way to put it. It is fascinating, isn't it, how this concept, democracy, which everyone seems to, well, revere, has such a slippery definition. And its practice varies so much across time and place.
Right.
And I think something we often forget is that our modern idea of democracy, it leans heavily on representation, the idea that someone else acts for you.
Yeah.
And that immediately throws up some really, really challenging questions.
Yeah.
Like, who really speaks for the people? And how should they do it? We're going to try and pull back the curtain on some of these nuances today.
Okay, let's start right at the roots then. The word itself, democracy, comes straight from ancient Greece. You've got kratos, meaning power or rule, and demos, meaning, well, the many or the people. But here's the kicker, the really surprising bit. Originally, it wasn't exactly a compliment. A lot of thinkers back then actually saw it pretty negatively, associated with, like, chaotic mob rule.
Yeah, they were worried.
Definitely. Worried about power ending up with the propertyless, maybe the uneducated masses. So while participation was okay to a point, democracy without limits, that was seen as genuinely dangerous.
That historical context is so important because it underlines that there's no single agreed-upon ideal democratic tradition. The debates about popular rule, they always seem to circle back to three kind of core questions.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, who exactly are the people who get to rule? On what grounds do we limit participation? Is it age, education, gender, social background? It's been debated constantly.
Sure, yeah.
Second, how should the people rule? Do they participate directly all the time?
Yeah.
Or is it through representatives they elect? And, what voting systems work best?
Good question.
And third, where should democracy apply? Is it just for politics, like government? Or should democratic principles extend into, say, family life, the workplace, maybe even the whole economy?
Those are fundamental, and they lead us right into this key distinction, direct democracy versus representative democracy.
Exactly.
If you look back at ancient Athens particularly, that was direct democracy in action. Citizens, well, eligible citizens, literally gathered, participated continuously. It was genuinely government by the people.
Yeah.
We still see, faint echoes of that today. Think about New England town meetings, or how places like Switzerland use referendums all the time, even the UK's big EU vote in '75.
That's a good example.
And actually, juries. Selected by lot, that's a direct link back to how some Athenian officials were chosen. Random selection.
It is. But in contrast, what most of us live under now, especially in big modern countries, is representative democracy. And this form, well, it's inherently more limited, isn't it?
How so?
Your participation is usually pretty infrequent, often just voting every few years. The public is kept more at arm's length from the day-to-day running of things.
Right.
And this is the crucial point for huge, complex societies. It's arguably the only practical way. Can you imagine trying to get millions of people to decide directly on every single law?
Chaos. Utter paralysis.
Precisely. So representation creates this necessary division of labor. You have professional politicians making decisions, but, and this is valuable, there's that accountability. You, the public, can essentially kick the rascals out next election if they mess up.
The power of the ballot box, indeed. Which brings us neatly to the dominant modern flavor, liberal democracy. It's important to remember the liberal bit often came before everyone got the vote.
That's right, yeah.
Many Western countries had constitutions, legal protections in the 19th century, long before universal suffrage. So the liberal part is all about limiting government power. Think written constitutions, bills of rights, independent courts.
Checks and balances?
Exactly, checks and balances. All designed to protect individuals from the state becoming too powerful. It also tends to champion individual freedoms, speech, property, and usually exists alongside a market economy, capitalism.
Absolutely. Those liberal protections are key. Then the democratic element adds the popular consent piece, expressed most obviously through voting, and built on that principle of political equality, one person, one vote. And crucially, the elections have to be regular, fair, and genuinely competitive. Joseph Schumpeter had this really interesting description, democracy as a competitive struggle for the people's vote. It captures that blend of sort of elite leadership, but under popular pressure.
Okay, so on paper, it sounds pretty solid. But liberal democracy hasn't exactly escaped criticism, has it?
Oh, definitely not. Strong criticisms.
Like what? Well, for starters, some argue that power always ends up with a small group no matter what the elections say. These are the elitists.
C. Wright Mills, people like that.
Right. They suggest that maybe the electoral competition is just a bit of a show, a facade to make us feel like we have a choice when the real decisions happen elsewhere.
Then you have the Marxist critique. They focus on what they see as this built-in tension. How can you have real political equality in a society with huge economic and social inequality?
Yeah, the link with capitalism.
Exactly. They'd argue that liberal democracy, especially tied to capitalism, gets manipulated by those with wealth and property. So genuine democracy becomes difficult for ordinary people.
And then there are the radical Democrats. They often see liberal democracy as, well, a bit thin. Facade democracy, some call it, where voting feels like a meaningless ritual.
They want something deeper.
Yeah, they push for a return to more classical ideas of direct popular self-government, thinkers like Pateman or Barber. They support things like more referendums, decentralizing power right down to the grassroots, arguing that people don't really rule under the current system.
These critiques really force us to ask, okay, what are the broader virtues and vices of democracy? Why, despite all this, is it the system almost everyone claims to want today?
Good question. What are the big arguments for it?
Well, the virtues are compelling. First, it's seen as vital protection against government becoming too powerful. You know, that old question, who guards the guardians?
Yeah.
Locke's idea of no taxation without representation fits here too, protection against arbitrary power.
Okay, protection. What else?
Beyond just protection, many argue it's a good thing in itself. Rousseau thought real freedom meant obeying laws you had a hand in making yourself. And J.S. Mills saw participation as crucial for people's intellectual and moral growth. Plus, it can foster social solidarity, giving everyone a stake.
Makes sense. But what about the arguments against it, the historical worries?
Oh, they're just as powerful. Plato, famously, argued ordinary folks just weren't competent enough to rule wisely. He wanted philosopher kings.
Right. Not exactly democratic.
Not at all. Then you have the classical elitists, Pareto, Mosca, Michels, with his iron law of oligarchy, basically arguing that true democracy is impossible. Power always concentrates in the hands of a few, inevitably.
Always. That's pretty pessimistic.
It is. And then there's that chilling fear of the tyranny of the majority. Tocqueville, Milligan, Madison in the U.S., they all worried about the larger group crushing individual liberties or minority rights.
Yeah, the majority imposing its will.
Exactly. That ties into the fear of putting power in the hands of the, quote, uneducated masses, who might be easily swayed by emotion, not reason. Ortega y Gasset wrote about this fear, too.
Wow, okay, so a real mix of strong arguments for and against the whole idea. Let's maybe pivot now to how it works in practice today, through representation.
Yes.
Because in our systems, politicians don't just rule. They're meant to stand for us or act on our behalf. But what does that actually mean to represent someone? That opens up a whole new can of worms, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And one of the huge debates here is, should our representatives act as true representatives, using their own judgment? Or should they just be delegates simply relaying instructions?
Explain that difference a bit more.
Well, Edmund Burke, the famous conservative thinker, argued very strongly that representatives owe their constituents their judgment, not just blindly following opinion. They could think about the good of the whole nation, not just their local patch. Otherwise, he feared Parliament would just be a clash of narrow interests.
Okay, so use your brain, basically.
Right. But contrast that with the delegate view. This says representatives are strictly bound by what their constituents tell them to do. They're just a mouthpiece. Radical Democrats, like Thomas Paine, worried that representation could become a substitute for democracy. They feared it would distance people from power, so they advocated things like really frequent elections, maybe popular initiatives, to keep representatives on a very tight leash, directly tied to the people's will.
And how do elections fit into this, the link between the voters and the politicians?
Yeah, well, for most people, elections and mandates are the core mechanism. The idea of the mandate doctrine is pretty central here.
The mandate.
It suggests that when a party wins an election, especially after putting forward policies in a manifesto. That win isn't just about getting into office. It's seen as a clear instruction from the people, a mandate to actually implement those policies. Sounds pretty democratic on the face of it.
It does sound clean. Win the election, do what you promised. But.
I sense some buts coming. What are the problems with that mandate idea?
Oh, there are quite a few significant drawbacks. For one, it can be a real straitjacket on government.
How do you mean?
Well, what if circumstances change drastically? A war, an economic crisis. A strict mandate might prevent the government from responding flexibly. It limits their room to maneuver.
Okay, inflexibility. What else?
It also kind of assumes voters are these perfectly rational beings who studied every policy detail. But let's be real. Voters are often, quite understandably, poorly informed on specifics. And they can be swayed by things that aren't strictly policy. A leader's charisma, party image, maybe just habit. So, does a single vote for a party really mean you endorse every single line in their manifesto? Probably not.
That's a fair point. And you gave that UK 2005 example earlier, Labour winning a majority of seats but only getting 35% of the vote. Can you really say they had a mandate for most people?
Exactly. It complicates the claim to a clear majority mandate. And think about countries with proportional representation, where you often get coalition government.
Yeah, common in Europe.
Right. Those coalition deals are often hammered out after the election. The specific policies weren't necessarily in any single party's manifesto that people voted on. So where's the mandate then?
It gets messy.
Very messy. Which leads some people to think about representation differently. Enter the idea of characteristic representation.
Characteristic, meaning what? Like the representatives should look like the people they represent.
Pretty much, yeah. The idea is that the legislature, the body of representatives, should be like a microcosm of society itself. It should reflect the different groups within society, social class, gender, ethnicity, maybe age, region.
Okay, why? What's the argument for that?
Well, it really appeals to groups who feel historically underrepresented or misunderstood, say socialists thinking about class, feminists about gender, anti-racist campaigners about ethnicity. They argue that only someone from that group who shares that lived experience can genuinely understand and articulate that group's specific interests and perspectives.
Because they've walked in those shoes.
Exactly. Shared experience is seen as key to authentic representation.
It sounds compelling. I can see the appeal. But are there criticisms of this idea too?
Oh, definitely. It's not universally accepted at all. Some see it as potentially a threat to democracy.
A threat? How?
Well, one argument is, do people really want to be ruled only by politicians who are exactly like themselves? Maybe they value competence or judgment more. And critics also worry that if you just select representatives to mirror society, you might just end up reflecting society's flaws, apathy, prejudice, lack of expertise.
You don't necessarily get the best people for the job, maybe?
Potentially. And perhaps the biggest worry is that it encourages politicians to focus only on narrow sectional interests, what's good for my group, rather than thinking about the broader common good. It could actually increase social division.
Interesting tension there. Okay, let's broaden the view even further now. What about democracy beyond the nation-state? You mentioned cosmopolitan democracy.
Yes, this has become a bigger topic with globalization. The idea is basically, since so many issues now cross national borders, climate change, finance, pandemics, maybe our democratic processes need to cross borders too.
Like a world parliament. Or empowering NGOs.
Ideas like that, yeah. But predictably, this faces big challenges. There's the massive democratic deficit. How can global institutions possibly be truly accountable to ordinary citizens scattered across the world?
I think it's almost impossible.
It's incredibly difficult. And then the role of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. While they do important work, their own democratic legitimacy is often questioned. Who elected them? How can they truly lead global democratization if they aren't directly accountable to a public?
Right. Lots of complex layers. Which brings us, I think, to our final big theme, the public interest.
The elusive public interest, yes.
Democratic governments are always saying they serve it, or the common good. These terms get thrown around so much they can feel a bit empty sometimes. But they're still absolutely central to political theory. Is there really such a thing as a shared interest that benefits everyone? Or is it just, an ideal we chase?
It's a fundamental question. And it really starts with defining interest. Is an interest just a felt preference? Something subjective you want, like lower taxes?
Okay.
Or is it a real need, something objective, maybe like clean air, that's good for you whether you consciously realize it or not? Liberals often start with individuals as self-interested. Socialists tend to see humans as more social, interdependent, where private and collective interests are kind of linked.
So how does this play out in defining the public interest?
Well, you get roughly two main ideas. One is just looking for shared or common interests. These are basically private interests that just happen to overlap for pretty much everyone. Like, we all benefit from national security or safe roads.
Makes sense. Things we can mostly agree on.
Right. The second idea is more radical. The collective body's interests. This is closer to Rousseau's general will. It's not just about adding up individual desires. It's about what society as a whole would truly want if everyone could think selflessly beyond their immediate personal gain, even if individuals don't see it that way at the time.
That sounds harder to pin down.
Much harder. Which leads straight to the critical question. Okay, but is there really a public interest? Does it actually exist?
What do the critics say?
Well, individualists and classical liberals, like Jeremy Bentham, basically said no. Only individuals have interests. Society isn't some separate thing with its own interests. For them, the public interest is just the sum total of all the private interests added together. Nothing more.
So just add up what everyone wants.
Pretty much. And modern pluralist theory kind of reinforces this. Pluralists see politics as this constant competition between different groups, business groups, unions, environmental groups, etc., all fighting for their own sectional interests. In that picture, there's really no space left for one single unifying public interest. It's just group conflict.
But surely we can defend the idea somehow. It feels like some things must be in everyone's interest.
Absolutely. And defenders push back against the idea that humans are just inherently selfish. Rousseau thought selfishness was learned, a corruption. Socialists see shared human needs. But even beyond that, you can point to public goods.
Like clean air, you mentioned.
Exactly. Clean air, a stable climate, maybe public health systems, energy conservation. These things benefit everyone, arguably. They're real interests, even if individuals acting alone might not choose to pay for them or make sacrifices for them. That's often why government steps in to secure these collective goods, sometimes against short-term private interests.
Okay, so the concept isn't dead, but using it in practice seems fraught with danger. The dilemmas of democracy, you called it.
Precisely. The big danger with abstract ideas like the general will is who gets to decide what it is. It can easily become a tool for politicians to just define the public interest however they want, to justify their actions.
Even leading to quite authoritarian outcomes.
History unfortunately shows that, yes. Leaders claiming to embody the people's true will, even while suppressing dissent. Think Mussolini or others. So the crucial safeguard has to be public accountability. Any claim to represent the public interest must be testable through regular, fair elections.
Which maybe brings us to Anthony Downs and his economic theory of democracy. Did he offer a way out?
Well, he offered a model. Downs famously viewed democracy as a kind of political market. Politicians are like entrepreneurs, selling policies. Voters are consumers, choosing the best offer. He argued this competition forces parties to move towards the center ground, to capture the most votes. By doing so, they have to pay attention to what the majority prefers. And that, Downs thought, is probably the closest we can get to approximating the public interest in practice.
So competition keeps them honest and focused on the majority.
That was the theory. But, like all models, it has limits. Big ones. First, it assumes society is relatively unified around a center ground. What about deeply divided societies? It might just mean the largest group always wins, ignoring minorities.
Right.
It can also push parties to focus on short-term popular giveaways rather than long-term public good. Think about difficult environmental policies, maybe unpopular now, but vital later.
The model doesn't really account for that long-term view.
Not easily. Plus, it makes pretty big assumptions about voters being rational consumers, which we've already questioned. And the whole model gets distorted if you don't have much party competition, if it's basically a monopoly or a duopoly.
Okay, so Downs' model isn't a magic bullet either. And this feels like the moment to bring in Kenneth Arrow and his rather depressing impossibility theorem.
Yes. Profound and, yes, a bit depressing for pure democratic theory.
What did Arrow basically show?
Imagine you and some friends are trying to rank pizza, burgers, and tacos. You might find A beats B, B beats C, but then C beats A. It's called a cyclical majority. Arrow showed mathematically that when voters have more than just two options and they rank their preferences, it's basically impossible to design a voting system that always translates those individual preferences into a single, consistent, rational collective choice for the group.
So you can't reliably figure out what the people actually want, even if they all vote sincerely.
In many situations with multiple options, yes. The math suggests that the way you structure the vote, the order things are considered, can actually determine the outcome, rather than some underlying will of the people. It fundamentally challenges the idea that elections perfectly aggregate preferences into a clear public interest.
Wow. So if Arrow is right, what are the implications? Where does that leave us?
Well, there are broadly two responses. One, advocated by people like Buchanan and Tulloch, is to say, okay, since collective choice is so flawed, let's drastically limit it. Government should only do things where there's practically unanimous agreement, a minimal state.
Very limited government.
Very. The alternative response is perhaps more pragmatic. It accepts that defining a true, mathematically aggregated public interest might be impossible. Therefore, politicians will always inevitably impose some meaning onto it. They'll interpret, they'll frame, they'll lead.
So they're not just passive reflectors of public will?
No. But the check on this isn't finding the perfect voting system. It's accountability. The fact that politicians have to face the voters again at the next election is the main constraint on them arbitrarily defining the public interest entirely as they please. It's an imperfect check, but maybe the best one we have.
Well, we've certainly gone on a profound journey today. It's clear that these big questions, who should rule, how are we represented, what is the public interest, they're far more complicated, far more tangled than how we usually talk about them.
Absolutely.
It really feels like it's not about finding neat, simple answers. It's more about constantly grappling with these, well, enduring dilemmas that really shape our political reality.
I think that's exactly right. That tension between the democratic ideal popular rule and the messy, practical challenges of actually doing it in diverse modern societies, that tension is always there. It really pushes you, doesn't it, to think about what kinds of accountability actually give meaning to government by the people or for the people where you live, and how we might, try to bridge that gap between the ideal and the reality.
Given the inherent challenges in defining the people and their interest, is it possible that democracy's enduring power lies not in providing perfect answers, but in constantly asking these very questions?